Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's 10 a.m. on Friday, May 13, 2025. You're watching Intro 6, probably your favorite new. Our hashtag for today's Precedent series. And today's content consists of three parts. In the first part, we will be informed about tradition, rupture, and the use of history in architecture from Usame. In the second part, we will ask Arda and Tofik some questions for our knowledge. And in the last part, we will have our interview. We wish you a pleasant viewing.
Thank you, Elif. Hi everyone, I am Sami from Group 6. Today I will talk about our subject, tradition, rupture, and the use of history in architecture. In this article, Stanford Anderson opposes traditionalism, which was traditionally accepted and rightly challenged by the majority of 20th century architects. He states that after modern architects rejected the authority of tradition, they sought authority in science or technology. He disagrees with Dr. Reynolds Benham's view that technology is the opposite of tradition and encourages architects to devote themselves to technology. Anderson proposes forming an interpretation of tradition that acknowledges the debt to the past but does not accept its an author. Anderson underlines the anti-traditionalism of modern architects and criticizes the futurists' view that rejecting tradition means rejecting tradition itself. He opposes Benham's claim that the emergence of modern architecture severed architects' ties with its traditions. He disagrees with Benham's definition of historians' role as adjusting and directing architecture and the view of science as the ultimate authority. Anderson questions the influence of modern architecture on tradition and argues that seeing tradition's influence on architecture as entirely harmful is a mistake. He notes that in his work, Theory and Design in the First Machine Age, where Benham mapped architecture recent past, Benham proposed scientific determinism as a way to eliminate the influence of tradition. Anderson emphasized that critical insights into the compelling nature of tradition should provide knowledge and predictions that can increase awareness of opportunities. Anderson argues that tradition is a necessary, common, dynamic ground on which we operate. He states that even if we consider a part of tradition as a tyrannical or ineffective, we still have a difficulty discarding even the limited parts of that tradition. He states that the best way to realize the best opportunities and achieve goals is through a sharp understanding of tradition and its influence. In the second part of the text, it is stated that architecture has been under the influence of three concepts known as representation, reason, and history since the 15th century. It's explained that each of those concepts serves as a different purpose. Representation aims to embody meaning, reason aims to encode truth, and history aims to save the idea of timelessness from change. It is stated that representation from the concept of emerged in Renaissance architecture derives its value through representation of ancient buildings. The article titled The End of the Classic, The End of the Beginning, The End of the End states that architecture has been under the influence of three concepts since the 15th century: representation, reason, and history. Each of these concepts has a different purpose. Representation aims to embody the idea of meaning, reason aims to encode the idea of truth, and history aims to save the idea of timelessness from the idea of change. Due to the continuity of these categories, it is true that this period exhibits a continuity in architectural thought, and its from a thought can be called classic. The article also mentions that the operation of the classic as an abstract system of relations became possible only in the late 20th century. This situation emerged with the acceptance of the architecture of early 20th century itself as a part of history. Thus, despite being different in style from previous architects, it has been observed that modern architecture exhibits a system of relations similar to the classic. Before the Renaissance, there was a harmony between language and representation, but with the Renaissance, architecture gained value through the representation of ancient buildings. It is stated that modern architecture, on the other hand, aimed to correct the Renaissance concept of the representation by suggesting that architecture should only embody its own function. It is explained that reason is also an important concept in architecture, and the rational design process came to the forefront during the Enlightenment period. However, it is also stated that reason is a construct and the architecture does not embody reason. Additionally, the article expressed that history plays a significant role in architecture, and before the 15th century, time was convinced in a non-dialectical manner. Thank you for listening to me, and let's continue with Elif Damar.
Thank you, Samuel. Now that we have clarified the topic, I would like to benefit from different perspectives on the subject. We will be joined by experts Arda and Tofik. Welcome, Mr. Arda.
Thank you, Elif.
And you, Mr. Tofik.
Thank you, Elif.
I have a few questions for you both. According to Anderson, how can architects engage with tradition critically without resorting to stylistic imitation?
I would like to start with critical engagement with tradition. Anderson argues that tradition serves as a necessary, common, dynamic ground upon which architects operate. He suggests that even when assessing a part of tradition as being tyrannical or ineffective, it is challenging to discard even relatively limited parts of that tradition. This difficulty implies that the best means for realizing opportunities and fulfilling goals, even radically new ones, are through an acute understanding of tradition and its influence upon us. I want to continue with a systematic process of transformation. According to Anderson, architects can engage with tradition critically by following a systematic process. Understanding traditions. Begin by truly understanding the traditions and their historical context, identifying problems. Recognize the issues or limitations within these traditions. Proposing transformations. Propose innovative transformations of the traditions to address identifying problems. Evaluating effects. Observe and evaluate the effects of these transformations to learn and improve. This approach allows architects to learn from the mistakes of their predecessors and to improve upon their own designs.
Avoiding literal revisionism, Anderson critiques literal revisionism, such as Pagin's Gothic revival, which emphasizes strict adherence to past forms. He suggests that such approaches can lead to a blind submission to traditions that might otherwise be critically observed and overthrown. Instead, he advocates for a critical understanding of tradition that enables architects to use those traditions more eloquently and freely as they see fit. I want to begin with that balancing continuity and change. Anderson emphasizes the importance of both continuity and change in architectural practice. He notes that society proceeds by changing its traditional myths, implying the impossibility of starting with a tabula rasa. Tradition provides a structure and regularity that's necessary for social experience, but these traditions gain no authority from their having occurred in the past and are constantly open to criticism and rejection.
Thank you for both. And the second question, what does Anderson mean by the end of the classical, and how does this stance challenge historical continuity in architecture?
The end of the classical Eisenman contends that the classical tradition, which has dominated Western architecture for centuries, has reached its conclusion. He suggests that the principles and forms that defined classical architecture are no longer adequate for addressing the complexities of modern life. This end doesn't signify a simple cessation, but rather a transformation in how architecture engages with its historical roots.
I would like to add that challenging historical continuity by declaring the end of the classical, Eisenman challenges the notion of historical continuity in architecture. He questions the idea that architectural practice should evolve linearly from past traditions, suggesting instead that architecture must confront and break away from its historical precedents. This stance implies that architecture should not merely continue the legacy of the classical but should critically engage with and redefine its relationship to history.
Thank you for that, and we can continue with the last question. How do these two texts reflect different attitudes toward architectural authorship and meaning making?
I agree with Anderson's view. In my opinion, architectural authorship is deeply tied to tradition, not as a constraint, but as a foundation for critical reflection. Stanford Anderson in Architecture and Tradition That Isn't Threat That argues that architects should engage with tradition not through stylistic imitation, but through a thoughtful critical process. For Anderson, tradition provides a shared ground of knowledge and cultural values from which architects can draw insight. He doesn't see the architects as a lone creature, but as someone who contributes to an ongoing historical conversation. Meaning in architecture then isn't self-contained, it emerges from his dialogue with the past and the community. Anderson proposes that by understanding and transforming tradition, architects can produce innovative works that still resonate with historical depth. I believe this fosters richer, more meaningful architecture that speaks to both the present and the past.
Actually, I don't agree with that idea. I see it very differently. Peter Eastman, in The End of the Classical, The End of the Beginning, The End of the End, argues that architecture must break from the weight of classical traditions. He views that architect not as a steward of continuity, but as an independent thinker who disrupts established norms. For Eastman, meaning in architecture isn't something inherited. It's something constructed through internal, formal logic and structural experimentation. He rejects the idea that architecture must communicate cultural or historical meaning in a conventional sense. Instead, it should challenge perception, resist fixed interpretations, and embrace ambiguity. In this way, authorship becomes a form of critical resistance, not continuity. To me, this stance is much more relevant today when architecture needs to confront complexity and redefine itself beyond nostalgic frameworks.
Thank you for joining our program.
You're welcome, Elif.
Now we will watch the final part, which is the interview section. Please enjoy. Today we are discussing a crucial question in architecture. Should architects today seek to break from our build upon historical precedents, and why? Tufik, what's your perspective on this?
I believe architects should definitely build upon historical precedents, but in a critical way. History offers a vast reservoir of knowledge, from cultural values to structural techniques that have stood the test of time. Ignoring this rich legacy would be a missed opportunity. However, it's important that we don't simply replicate the past. Instead, we should interpret and adapt these traditions to fit the needs and challenges of today. For instance, modern sustainable architecture can still draw from traditional methods of passive heating or cooling, but it must be reimagined using contemporary technologies and materials.
So you are advocating for continuity but with innovation, right?
Exactly, we can't build in vacuum, and dismissing the past would be a mistake. By understanding historical forms, materials, and techniques, we gain insight into how they shaped or built environment. Building on this knowledge gives us a foundation to innovate responsibly.
Interesting, but Arda, I know you have a different view. Do you think architects should break from tradition?
Yes, I think it's crucial for architects today to break from historical precedents. The world has changed drastically, and so have the challenges we face. We need to embrace new ways of thinking and creating, not to be constrained by outdated models. Technology, environment concerns, and social change demand a new architectural language. Innovation requires us to step outside the shadows of the past and redefine the role of architecture in shaping the future.
So you see breaking from tradition as essential for progress.
Absolutely. It's about creating new forms, new approaches, and new meanings that reflect the world we live in today rather than relying on old patterns.
Thank you to both of you. It's clear that both perspectives have their merits. Content with critical adoption versus creative rupture. Today we're discussing two major architectural thinkers, Peter Eastman and Stanford Anderson. The question is, can Eastman's radical formalism be reconciled in any way with Anderson's intellectual reading of tradition? Halil, let's start with you.
Okay, thanks. I would say that on the surface they are fundamentally different. Eichmann sees architecture as a self-referential discipline detected from historical narratives, cultural context, and function in some cases. He creates meaning from within the formal language of architecture itself. Anderson, on the other hand, argues that architecture can't escape tradition. For him, tradition isn't something to replicate, but something to critically engage with, so reconciliation seems difficult.
So you're saying their views are incompatible.
Not entirely, while their end goals differ, they share a deep concern for how meaning is constructed in architecture. Eichmann might reject tradition, but he does so through a highly intellectual and theoretical lens. That in itself is a kind of dialogue with architectural history, just an antagonistic one. Anderson's method is more scientific. He believes architects must learn from and transform tradition, but both believe in architecture as a form of uniquity.
Interesting. So do you think there's any common ground?
Yes, I think the common ground is in their commitment to critical thinking. They both reject surface level design solution. Eichmann challenges tradition by breaking it, while Anderson challenges it by reinterpreting it. They are on opposite sides of the same conservation. It's less about reconciliation in outcome and more about a shared commitment to question and redefining architecture meaning.
That's a helpful way to frame it. Thank you.
You are welcome.
We have reached the end of our program. We hope it has been both enjoyable and informative for you. Wishing you health and happiness.